Great. So, welcome everybody to our webinar from Signs At, based at Heriot-Watt University, Signs at HWU. We've been running online webinars every year for the past 3 years. This is our third one, and we thought that it would be perfect to do it today to celebrate International Women's Day. So we've got some research going on at the university focused on female experiences or on gender. So we're going to showcase that research today and open up some discussion around International Women's Day, or whether it should be, in fact, International Gender Day. So first, I'm going to ask each of the presenters here that you can see on Zoom to introduce themselves. I'm Annalise Koesters, this is my sign name, and I coordinate Signs at HWU. And also we have a research group that is focusing on sign language topics in quite a diverse range of subjects. There's about 20 deaf and hearing researchers involved, focusing on deaf culture and different aspects of sign language use. So the 4 of us here today are all from that group. So I'm going to pass over to Sanchu to introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Sanchu. I'm a PhD student at Heriot-Watt University, and I'm going to talk more about what I'm researching about deaf Indian migrants to the UK. I'll talk about that later in my presentation.
Hello, I'm Ina Martins, and my presentation topic is going to be about deaf lesbians.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm a PhD student at Heriot-Watt University as well. And my topic is gender in terms of sign language interpreters.
Now, we should have one other person with us today, Jemina Napier, but unfortunately she's unwell and can't be with us today. So now I'm going to pass over to Sanchu, who will start off the presentations, who will then pass it over to Ina, and then finally to Caroline. So we'll follow that order within the presentations. Any questions you have, please post them in the Q&A box, and then later the panelists will select them and answer them. If you have any questions that you prefer to ask in sign language, hang on to those until we have the question and answer session with the panel, and then we'll invite people to turn their webcams on so that they can sign any questions that they may have. But through the presentation, if you want to write your questions, you can put them in the Q&A box, and then I will pass them on to the presenters at the appropriate time. Okay, so if we're ready, Sanchu, over to you for your presentation.
Great, I'll share my screen.
Good luck, Sanchu.
Okay, I hope you can see me okay and see the screen. Oh, sorry, there we go. Sorry about that. Thank you, Annalise. So today I'm going to talk about, as it says on the screen, the resilience of deaf Indian migrant women. So when we're thinking about International Women's Day, this is very applicable. So first I want to talk about my project and the PhD and the research that has emerged from the mobile deaf overarching project. When we're looking at people's mobility, deaf people's mobility from over borders, maybe temporarily staying in different countries and sometimes moving permanently. And the element that I have looked at is deaf Indian women who have met a British deaf man, married and moved to the UK, and particularly to London. And I've been looking at the process that they've gone through and how their lives have completely changed, moving and from one area that they lived in and grew up in, and then having to embed themselves in a whole new culture and community in a new country, learn a new language and learn English, and how they've navigated through those networks and systems and how they've managed that as they've gone through that process of migration, and many of the barriers that they've looked at and how that they've experienced and how they've overcome those. So I've picked a few stories to share today around resilience that really celebrates these women's resilience in their move to the UK. Just to give you a little context, my research is based in London. Because London is such a diverse city, we have people there from all over the world living in London. There's many communities and many languages used in London. And the Indian community in particular is where I took my focus. And the research took place during the period of Brexit, when there were issues of attitude towards migrants. The government policies were changing, social attitudes were changing. There was quite a lot of negativity around migrants. There were issues with services and support for people moving to the UK, and quite a lot of barriers as a result. So historically, if we look back to the time of colonization, many Indian people moved to the UK. And through times of war, for example, we didn't have enough of a labour force in the UK. And so the UK reached out to people from the Commonwealth and actually advertised for people to come and work in Britain. And then later, those workers would bring their families here. So all over the UK, you see large communities, particularly in London, but also elsewhere in the UK. But in London, it's mostly Harrow and Brent. And you see many people congregating there, bringing their families there. There's interacting with and socializing with people in those areas from their own communities. And you see that there's food from the cultures in those areas more. But my research took place throughout the pandemic, which of course impacted the data collection. So I'm just going to talk about my methodology. As I mentioned before, COVID had a huge impact on the data collection. I couldn't meet people. I couldn't follow them on their journey because we had of all the restrictions with social distancing, and I was also pregnant, so I was at high risk as well. So I had to do ethnography differently. I had to develop this rapport through text messaging. I had to talk to participants differently. I had to try to find out about their everyday life over the period of about a week. I wanted really to have a flavor of their everyday life. So I asked them to take photographs and take videos of themselves, signing about their experiences, and just really have a snapshot over a week of their lives. And then I was able to talk to them more about what they documented in that week. And I also asked them to do some portraits of themselves and talk about what they were like before they moved to the UK, and see how they transitioned from being citizens of a different country to moving here. I also did observations, particularly on their social media presence on Instagram and Facebook and so on. And so some people joined my research group later. And so I looked a lot at the social media there to see what they had been doing during the same week that the others had documented their experiences. And then I interviewed them around those experiences. So much of those conversations for data collection were informal because it was really important that I developed a rapport with my participants. But then I was on maternity leave, but I was still keeping in touch with them. I was still seeing how they were getting on and seeing how their lives had changed as they were living in London. And then when I came back to work after maternity leave, I still had that connection with them. And I still had the data that I had collected beforehand. And I wanted very much to stay close to their narrative and close to their experiences. So I had many field notes plus all of the information that they provided me with. And I just want to briefly talk about the background of my participants. All of them moved to London based on a marriage visa, because they got married. 3 people moved fairly recently in 2014, that sort of time period. And 3 of them are of a very similar age. They married around 30 and moved here. And 2 others moved a couple of years ago, and they were of similar age as well. 4 of them were from middle-class backgrounds, and 1 was from a working-class background. And the middle-class backgrounds, when they moved, found that they had, if you like, were demoted in the class system because they were moving to a different family setup and a different class setup. So then I was able to look at issues of privilege and disadvantage and see what barriers they encountered and their experiences of that change. The husbands were all British citizens. 3 were born in the UK and 2 were born elsewhere, born abroad and moved here and later became British citizens. 4 were from the same area of India, Bombay, and 1 was from outside Kolkata. Some of them knew each other before the project. 4 of them had actually visited countries other than India, so they had experience of travel, but 1 had not at all. In fact, it was the first time they'd been on a plane just to come to the UK to get married. I want to talk about their experiences of developing a sense of belonging. Firstly, through the move to a new home. Secondly, of integrating with the deaf community. And thirdly, with work or education. Firstly, in terms of their home, they'd obviously moved from a home. They all moved from their family home. 1 person had experience living away from home, but there were different power structures and dynamics within those family settings. In some of them, it was the father who was dominant, and in others, it was the mother who was dominant. They had different religions and cultures, and some had quite a luxurious lifestyle and had never experienced any kind of independence because their family provided servants to do everything and all the cleaning and the cooking. And then when they moved to the UK, to their new home, their life changed completely. They were forced to become independent, and the home was expected, the mother-in-law was dominant and expected the new daughter-in-law to take on those roles and obligations for cleaning, for cooking, for domestic chores. And as a wife, when they later became pregnant and became a mother, that changed too. So I wanted to look at the experience of that journey, look at the traditional points of view. So we've got traditional views and modern takes on marriage, and there were some tensions within that. There were no clear defining lines, but you could see that there were differences of experience, and some people wanting to take a more modern attitude toward life and resisting some of the tensions, resisting some of that obligation to conform to a more stereotypical norm, if you like, or the mother-in-law's expectation. Some of the women didn't really have a chance to push back against that dominance. Each of the women had many narratives, many rich narratives to share, and many negative experiences, certainly around the attitudes of society when they compared to the community they grew up in and visiting abroad. When they moved to the UK, they experienced a lot of negativity. And they did notice a difference, that they needed to adjust individually to match the expectations of society here. And then when they went to meet deaf people, you know, they were used to, in their home country, go and visit other deaf families' homes and have meals and things like that. And it would be quite spontaneous, but here they would have to plan things in advance. And they found it difficult to actually have the opportunity to go into people's homes, for example. They usually found they had to meet in more public places. And so they struggled to develop those relationships with other members of the deaf community. In terms of employment and the employment market, they found many barriers there. Some of the women had qualifications and had a good career in their home countries. And then when they moved, they found that their qualifications were not recognized. They would have to restart their training, and then go back to the bottom of that career ladder. And many of them, some of them did actually persevere with that, but find that it ended up not being quite the job that they expected. And some of them were saying, we really want to get to where we were, but there's so many barriers in terms of qualifications, English language, learning BSL, and they found it quite a struggle to restart that career. So 3 of them felt that it really impacted on their own sense of self as a deaf Indian woman in London. And it took time for them to work through that process and those experiences of moving and having such a sudden life change. So I'm going to recount the experience of one person in particular. This is Vandana. Obviously, it's not her real name. So her experience was that the deaf community, when she first arrived in the UK, was very difficult. The attitudes were negative. She felt that they were very critical of her, particularly her sign language, because she wasn't fluent in BSL, and also attitudes to do with her not being deaf enough. And her perception was that the ethnic deaf community hadn't progressed enough. She felt that they were very dependent on their parents. They didn't have any work. They weren't independent. And also she felt that she wanted to be progressive, and that her own experiences of the US community were very different. And so she had a lot of tension there. And she wanted to be productive with her time. She wanted to integrate. She wanted to be part of the London community. She wanted to find work. She wanted to learn to drive. She wanted to be a good housewife. She wanted time. She wanted to make good use of her time. So she decided not to learn BSL. And after a year, she secured a job in a retail sector. She was very proud because in India, it was very difficult to get work, but she was able to secure work here. And that was off. She started off voluntary. And she said that that was important because she needed the experience. And she accepted a 6-month voluntary post. And her employer saw that she worked well, and after 1 month gave her a full-time contract. And so she felt really validated, and she was delighted with that. But the working hours were very long. She was working 6 days a week from 8 in the morning to 7:30 in the evening. And then when she fell pregnant, it had a very big impact on her health. She struggled through the pregnancy. She struggled with the tube and working long hours, and there was no flexibility with the work. So she actually had to go to hospital for a week because she was that unwell. And she experienced similar health problems with her second pregnancy. And there was no empathy or flexibility in the workplace. She really just had to get on with it. She took maternity leave. I mean, mine was 7 months or so, but hers was much shorter. She had to go back to work quite quickly. She had to stop breastfeeding early as a result of that. So she had to deal with an awful lot. And she also felt that after the 6 years, she needed to stop that work because her mother-in-law felt that she could no longer cope with the childcare. So then she was torn. She tried asking for flexi time to be part-time, but was refused. So she felt she had no choice but to leave work. So I said to her, my goodness, that's an awful lot to give up with all that experience. And she said, no, I'm grateful for the experience. It's made me stronger. It's made me as a person very determined. I'm a strong woman. I'm an independent woman. I'm a survivor, which was a very powerful message. So then when she became a housewife, she found the burden of housework was very heavy. And again, you know, that relentlessness of being a parent, she meant that she had very little time to engage with the deaf community, and she became quite depressed. But when her children were in school, she was able then to engage with the parents of the children. And although they were hearing, many of them were Asian, and so she had a connection there. And she became quite assertive about her own needs as a deaf woman, and they were very adaptive for her. So she felt that she had a sense of pride and belonging, and that she was recognized and acknowledged and respected by that community. So then she felt that that was something very positive. And when she compared it with the deaf community in the UK, she really felt that it was more progressive to engage with the hearing parents of children. And when I asked her about her own views of things, she said, I am a very independent woman. I fight against all odds. I view myself as a strong woman, which I thought was very powerful. If I talk now about the impact of COVID, in my most recent interviews, I asked about what's changed through that time of the pandemic. In particular, how things have changed by being at home. And some people, well, it did vary, the stories varied. One person felt that they built up a good relationship with the deaf community, but it was, sorry, that relationship with the deaf community was delayed because they couldn't meet, they couldn't get together, they were socially distanced, deaf people were frightened to get together, Zoom is not the same. And then also looking for work was difficult. And so there was an awful lot of time stuck at home. And therefore they felt they hadn't really embedded themselves in the UK. They weren't really settled here. Others felt it was productive because they spent the time learning BSL, learning English so that they could progress. One person was stuck in London and she would normally be traveling a lot. Say 8 or 9 times a year, she would travel for work. And for the first time in her life, she was stuck in a city. And she said, this is really interesting. It affected her relationship with London. She said prior to the pandemic, she didn't really feel that London was home, but being restricted and not able to travel changed that perception. And she has recently set up a business in London. So now she's feeling much more at home in the UK as a result. One person said that throughout lockdown, it was the best time of my life. It was amazing because before that, my work was so fast. I was on this treadmill all the time. I had no time to meet people, no time to do anything. And the pandemic meant that I had more quality time with my family. I could spend time with my husband. And she didn't really have much of a relationship with the deaf community. It was more superficial. So her world really was her family. And she was quite disappointed when lockdown ended and she had to go back to some version of normal. So lockdown had different impacts. For some people, it was positive, having more time to engage with their friends from all over the world. They're not having to work, therefore being able to engage online with people and their own families, and they really enjoyed that. Some people said they found it difficult. There were tensions in the family home, particularly with the mother-in-law. One person said that I felt homesick. This is not my home. I want to go back to India. I haven't seen my family. I have a baby. They haven't seen my baby. But then recently, when I asked them again if they were okay and how they were getting on, they said they were happier. Back at work, their family have been able to visit. So she was feeling more assertive, more able to deal with everything. I just want to show you some of the photographs. So the visual data that I've been collecting. So throughout lockdown, I asked them to take some photos. One person went running, somebody took a photo of their cooking and of themselves cooking. Somebody learned to drive, so they took a photo of that. There were online activities. So there was an advantage there through lockdown that there were more online opportunities through Zoom. So there was a lot of remote learning going on. So one person learned English from an Indian person. And then you can see some yoga and exercise pictures as well. So in conclusion, I'm hoping through my research and what I've presented today that women's narratives is nuances, and the nuances of their gendered experiences really show how their life journey is impacted by external things, by the systems, by the way that society is established. But each of those stories really shows the independence and assertiveness and the determination that women have to work their way through those systems, to navigate through those systems and achieve what they're hoping to achieve. But migration is a gendered process. Women's stories, I think, are very powerful. It really shows that resilience, that determination, and that desire to progress through life. And so, yes, I want to thank all of those women for sharing their stories and for opening up their lives to me. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you very much for watching.
Lovely. Thank you, Sanchu. That was a beautiful presentation. Very, very interesting. Thank you. So now I would like to invite Ina Martins to give her presentation. Hi, everybody. Over to you, Ina. Okay, I'll just share my screen. I hope everyone can see that. Great. So hello, everybody. I'm Ina Martins. Oh, just get my slides sorted. I can't actually see my notes. I wonder if it's possible for me to see my notes. I've got a Word document with my notes on it. I do need my notes. Okay. Annalise is going to share her screen with my slides on them so that I can access my notes. Just give me a minute. I'll just start the presentation, even though there's no PowerPoint. So hopefully you can all see me. Hello, I'm Ina Martins. This is my sign name. I'm a first year PhD student, and I'm still learning how to use the technology, as you can see. I started my PhD in September, which means I've been doing about 6 months work on it to date. And unlike Sanchu, I haven't yet managed to do data collection. I've been spending a great deal of my time reading the literature. So today I am going to present to you my topic, which is about queer, deaf, lesbians and their geographies, their spaces. So I'm also going to talk about my research questions, plus a little bit of the literature and a few of my questions that have come up through my reading. And I'll give you some examples from my own life as well. So the title is Deaf Lesbians. You know, in deaf studies, you know, there's a very famous book called sometimes the Deaf Bible. It's called Understanding Deaf Culture in Search of Deafhood. And that's why I've chosen the title In Search of Deaf Lesbians. It's a little bit of a pun on that book title. And really, it's been my life's mission as well to search for deaf lesbians. Since I've moved to Edinburgh, I've asked every BSL user that I've met if they know any deaf lesbians, and I haven't been able to find any so far. So if there are any deaf lesbians out there watching, please contact me. And also, within the literature, on queer literature studies, queer studies, and also deaf studies, within queer studies literature, there's a lot of research that focuses on queer geographies, for example. A lot of articles that have been published on that, but very little on deaf lesbians. The majority focus is on queer people and their experiences, their geographies, a little bit on general disability, but very little on deaf lesbians. And similarly, in deaf studies, the situation is the same. There's very little information, a little bit about intersectionality and deafness, For example, the book that I mentioned before, Understanding Deaf Culture, it's a big book of 500 pages. And it talks about queer deaf people, not lesbian deaf people, specifically queer deaf people, in 5 sentences. So obviously things are changing, but still there is very little literature around my topic. So there are publications within deaf studies around sign language, around deaf geographies, but queer deaf geographies in particular is a new field. And of course, with it being a new field, that raises many, many questions, many potential questions. And up till now, every time I read an article, my thinking and my research questions change, and I want to change my PhD research questions. I'm left thinking after reading what I can change. When I read a book, I think about throwing away my existing research questions because I've got so many new ideas. So now I want to talk a little bit about my research questions, which might even change, as I was saying, as quickly as tomorrow. So my first question is, what are the spatialities and temporalities of deaf lesbians in London? I should mention in London. And I've asked this research question because there is research that shows that lesbian spaces are different in temporality. They tend not to be permanent, but they're temporary. For example, they can develop in a pub if there's an event going on, or that pub can close after a number of years, and then the space moves to a different pub. So you can see these spaces change. This is slightly different from gay men's deaf spaces because they tend to be more permanent. And also, just as Sanchu's research on London on the Indian migrants showed, the deaf spaces that they encountered change at a rate of knots as well. They can be fixed for about a month or so, and this has an impact on deaf lesbian spaces and their networking. My second question was about what strategies deaf lesbians use to create deaf queer lesbian spaces. And there is some research about how lesbian women create lesbian spaces, particularly around Black lesbians, and what strategies they have used, but nothing I've been able to find thus far on deaf queer lesbian spaces. But let me give you one example from my own life. When I moved to Edinburgh, I started sharing a flat with another person who's also queer. He's a gay deaf man. That was half luck and half planned. And just next to our flat, there's a queer pub, and we go there regularly. And so we've tried to make this pub a queer deaf space. How have we done this? By inviting as many deaf people as we can, or sign language users, to the pub. Queer or straight, it doesn't matter, because the pub is already a queer space, and we are adding this layer of deafness to it. So that's an example of one of the strategies that I have envisaged. My third question is how government policy and procedures influence queer deaf lesbian spaces. So the government disability policy, for example, in London, means that deaf people have the right to have a free bus travel pass. They don't have to pay. They also have the right to PIP, which means that they get access to government funding. Also, deaf people and disabled people are typically given council flats as accommodation. There is a research that shows, and I mean, Annalise's research in India has shown that, for example, in the Indian trains, there were disability coaches, and that had an impact on the creation of deaf networks, because deaf people started to meet in the disabled coach, and that became a deaf space. There's also research linked to gentrification and queer people. And gentrification gentrification, this is my sign for it, really means that, you know, rents of accommodation costs, the cost of living rise so steeply that it's impossible for people to continue living in that area and they have to move out. And that has a disproportionate impact on disabled people, people of colour and queer people. But of course, deaf people get government PIP funding. So it is possible that deaf lesbians can use that funding to allow them to mitigate the rise in rents. Also, areas where there are council flats seem to be more robust at resisting gentrification compared to other areas. So there's less gentrification in these areas. So they're in some ways protected from it. And many deaf people live in council flats. So that may be another area of impact. So those are my research questions. Now, at the start, I said, if there's any deaf lesbians out there watching this, please contact me. But actually, I want to open that invitation up to all of you. Please contact me, stay in touch, email me your questions. If you know of any articles that I should read, please do let me know. If you know of any spaces for deaf queer people or any areas of interest, then please do get in touch. I'm going to start to write a blog. So maybe you'll see me on Twitter infrequently and you can contact me there. And also I will type my email address in the chat box. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you, Ina. Thank you. Thank you. That was a lovely presentation. Great. I'm sorry about the PowerPoint. Maybe we can put it later on social media. So we will give you the information later that was on the slide. So thank you very much, Ina. So now I'm going to invite Caroline to give her presentation. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll share my screen. Okay, I'm hoping that you can see that clearly and you can see me clearly. So hi, my name's Caroline and I'm a sign language interpreter in Belgium and I have been for about 10 years. So I'm now at HWU University as a PhD student, as already been said, and I've been a PhD student for about 10 months. So my data collection has not started yet either. I'm in the same position as Ina. So the information I'm going to share in my presentation is still in the early days of my forming of ideas and things like that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm very much in these early stages. And my research topic is conference interpreting gendered? So this is particularly looking at conference interpreting and whether or not there are more men in positions of control or dominance in conference interpreting settings. Okay. So unfortunately, Jemina can't be with us today. She's unwell, she has COVID. That's how life is at the moment. Sadly, people get COVID and that's how it goes. But Jemina has presented on this topic of sign language interpreters and the demographic and the number of women in our field and the predominance of women in our field. And so I'm going to include some of her information in this presentation. So working sign language interpreters generally are predominantly female. You can see that there's different research findings, but about 80 to 85% of the profession are women. Of course, in different countries that varies, but overall the pattern is 80 to 85% of sign language interpreters are women. And it's just curious to wonder why. So Jemina has already done some research on this and looking at child brokering for sign language. And that's looking at deaf and hearing families. And Jemina found that the first daughter was doing most of that brokering, or took on the role of being the primary person for brokering. And they would often maybe represent the dominance of females in the field. But then we wonder why. Is that because we see sign language interpreters working, we see that as a helping profession, and did that resonate? It's a service. It's also seen as a caring profession. Is that as a stereotype more associated with women? It's often in settings such as education and healthcare that we see interpreters working as well. So that was one area of interest. And then looking at deaf interpreters, we found that there were more men working in that area compared to hearing sign language interpreters. And deaf sign language interpreters were around 60% female, so still a higher number of women in that profession. But much of the research and the findings and the questions really have looked at men and women. And sometimes an interpreter may not associate with those two categories. And they may say, well, where's the third option? Where's the non-binary option? And so the research to date has mostly been binary, but of course now we're seeing things change and those third and fourth options are opening up more. So data will shift over time. And there has recently been a census of sign language interpreters where those additional categories have been included. So we are going to start seeing a more nuanced reflection of gender within the profession. And it may not be just gender, it's also we need to look at ethnicity, religion, deaf and hearing status and background. And there are many elements to consider. So looking at the research to date on sign language interpreters and gender, most of the research, well, there's not a lot of it to be fair, but much of it talks about individual experiences, saying, I think, or I've experienced barriers, or I have had this experience, and so on. And then when we look at interpreter trainers again will say, well, I think this, or I've seen that. So there's lots of experiences being shared, but not necessarily backed up by hard evidence. There's not a lot of data to sit behind those viewpoints. So in terms of research topics, one looking at the language use of interpreters, whether there's any difference between male and female interpreters and the way that they use their language. Is there an impact on the people using that service, or how hearing people perceive deaf people according to the gender of the interpreter? There's very little research around interpreter positionality, about status, for example, or remuneration. There is some research, but very little, also around the role of the interpreter and the conflict that an interpreter may experience. So, for example, as a female interpreter, I may experience negativity from society because of my gender. And so there can be a role conflict, going out to work and accepting that that's the way society is constructed and some of the attitudes they may experience. But when we look at spoken language interpreters, we see a similar pattern, similar topics from the research as well. There's not a lot of research, but what there is seems to show a commonality there. There's one PhD research from Paul Michaels, And he looked at men and men's experiences of interpreting, which was an interesting one to look at because I'm very interested to see how his research goes. And I actually think he's in this webinar. So it's good, it's healthy for us to be looking at these aspects, and gender is one aspect. But if I think about it, I am, for example, a female, and that's it. No, I'm not just a female. I'm also white. I'm also hearing. So there's a number of elements that sit within me as a person that make up who I am. And so when interpreters are going out to assignments, they have a number of elements to their own personality that will impact on that work and on that setting. And if they go to a different setting, it will have a different impact. So to date, with all my reading linked to sign language interpreting, what I feel has been quite important is gender, but also ethnicity. And all those different identities that come into play. And I think for sign language interpreters, it's important to see who is there and who is not there, and to recognize those gaps. So for my research, I want to include those who are not there as well. So back to my question, which is around conference interpreting and whether that is more male dominated. Firstly, I need to talk about conference interpreting itself and what that represents. And for me, it's a more formal setting. So for example, it could be a conference, it could be a meeting, it may be a workshop, and networking as well, which is a vital part of these settings. And my focus is on international sign interpreting spaces. I also want to clarify, and to touch on this, it's good for us to see the different numbers of the proportions of men and women in sign language interpreting fields, and to see those statistics. But what's also important and timely is for us to see who's in charge, who's leading, who has the power within these settings. And that can change. So dominance and predominating and dominating are two different things. You may already know that international sign interpreters are accredited by the WFD and WASLI. So they hold a list of accredited international sign interpreters. So when you're accredited, you're able to put your name on that list. And they've recently added some new names. And we now have 42 interpreters on that list. 17 are deaf and 25 are hearing. And you can see the proportions here on the screen, that there are more, very slightly more men than women. But what's interesting then is when you think about the general sign language interpreting profession, it's very much more women. But when it comes to the international stage, that's quite different. Then when you also look at whether they're hearing or deaf, you can see that hearing interpreters are mostly women, 60%. But when we look at deaf interpreters, there are far more men, which is a very interesting statistic. But again, I just want to touch on the idea that just looking at these binary genders is not necessarily helpful. I've been looking through the websites, through doing research. I have photographs of faces of, if you go through that website and that list of names, you can see the faces, and you can see that some of the people possibly are not binary. And I want to ask them whether they self-identify with the category that they've been put in. Maybe you're thinking, well, Why does this matter? Why is this important? I think what's clear is that gender is everywhere. And before Sanchu's presentation, I think it's fairly clear that gender has an impact, as Sanchu said. We could ignore it or try to ignore it. We could, but maybe we don't want to do that. And we live in a society that does see gender as important. So we as interpreters are working with people. Every day we're meeting different people. So it's important for us to understand the impact of gender and engage with that. It's not just about your own gender, it's about the gender of the people we're working with, the deaf people and the hearing people. It all has an impact, and society as a whole has an impact. So there's a few examples here around settings. Firstly, talking about conferences. Maybe there's a female deaf presenter. Maybe the audience is mostly male and 2 male interpreters working in that setting. So just thinking about what kind of impact that might have in terms of networking. If you had a female academic in that setting, and maybe there were more female participants and more female interpreters, would that affect things? Would that affect the process, the way that networking happened and people engaged? Or if it was a meeting with a male deaf professional, maybe the audience is mixed and the interpreter is non-binary. What would be the impact of that? How would that form? In a workshop, perhaps it's a male deaf professional, the audience is mixed, and you have a team of interpreters who are mixed male and female, deaf and hearing. Is there an impact there? And what would that be? And how would that dynamic play out? I can respond in some ways. I can't respond yet to this, but this is the kind of thing I want to look at. What is the impact of the gender of the interpreters in those settings? So I'm going to look thinking about deaf professionals and interpreters. For focusing on deaf professionals, I am interested to see how deaf professionals work with interpreters in international settings. How do they manage those intersections of gender and how does that play out? And also, do they think about that? When they're choosing their interpreters, do they deliberately choose male interpreters or female interpreters? Is that a factor? How do they pick who they work with? Also with deaf professionals, thinking about what their experience is, how they've worked with interpreters of varying genders in terms of their own gender as well. And how does that intersect? And how does their gender intersect with other identities and privilege and disadvantage? So then looking at interpreting, I'm curious to see in international settings, because why is there more men? Why do we see more men in international interpreting settings? Is it the interpreters who go to work in those settings? How do they construct their gender? And how is that applicable? What's their experience there? How do interpreters construct gender? And how does that intersect with their other identities in terms of, again, privilege and disadvantage? So I'm curious to look at that. But as with Ina, my questions are not fixed. I haven't completely decided what my research question will be in the end, because I'm still working through that process. Last week, I was in Edinburgh, And in exploring the city, I saw this and took a picture of it to put in my presentation and to bring to today. So I wanted to conclude with this picture because I think it's really important for all of us to think about the individuals and their stories. And so I'm really interested in this, in both deaf professionals and interpreters in international settings, thinking about their experiences of gender, their stories, their identities, and how everything intersects. So that is me. Thank you very much for watching. And I'm very keen to hear your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Caroline. That was a lovely